Suicide rates among Indigenous peoples in Canada are at least 5 to 6 times higher than non-Indigenous people. But why? Without context, many often assume that this is the result of poorly educated communities who engage in substance abuse and other harmful practices. What these people do not understand is that their own perceptions are a product of the very same colonial mindset responsible for isolating Indigenous communities in the first place. Considering a number of Canadians presently hold these views, it is clear that colonialism has permeated through modern discourse, as a small minority of respected literature promotes Indigenous traditions and values. This is particularly true regarding the source of Canadian law, as it is widely adopted from English common law. Upon European settlement, Indigenous practices were not only abandoned but belittled and directly violated. While non-Indigenous communities grew and gained power, Indigenous communities suffered great loss and were ultimately deprived of the resources to adequately deal with these losses. By limiting Aboriginal rights and freedoms, programs and solutions to grief have ultimately become inaccessible. This loss then continues to be passed down through generations as we have isolated these individuals, secluding them in a perpetual cycle of suffering. This chart from my Introduction to Law in Canada textbook does a good job of summarizing the individualizing and isolating effects the implementation of Euro-Canadian law had on Indigenous communities by doing no less than violently forcing them to assimilate. The institutionalization of these principles through the implementation of legislation regarding education, healthcare, and social welfare has significantly impacted the degree of control Aboriginal people have in their communities and over their own lives. In order to understand Indigenous experience in Canada, we must first understand what it means to be Indigenous. The term Indigenous is used to refer broadly to peoples of long settlement and connection to specific lands who have been adversely affected by incursions by industrial economies, displacement, and settlement of their traditional territories by others. For Aboriginal peoples, appreciation of land involves acknowledging ecosystems and relationships, as the connection to the natural world is made through interactions between community and space. It then becomes very evident that the use of land and deprivation of natural resources for capitalist purposes runs perpendicular to Indigenous values, while it challenges their rights to the land. Exercises of colonial power continue to occur as Indigenous peoples and their land are exploited for economic and political gain. Aboriginal peoples often experience a unique form of disconnect as they have been forced to abandon many aspects of their traditional culture and subsequently their identity. This problem is further emphasized by the discriminatory nature of life in Canada. Aboriginal people are then unable to harvest feelings of belonging through their traditional culture or through relations with the non-Aboriginal population, as there is an obvious disparity in perceptions of and values held by each community. Residential schools have hindered the parenting abilities of those who have attended. This is due to the fact children are removed from family dynamics and subject to strict educational regimes. This lack of connection and understanding has led to the adoption of poor coping strategies by Aboriginal parents and their children. Additionally, negative relationships with the education system have deterred First Nations people from pursuing higher levels of education, causing a significant income gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal workers. The combination of these factors contribute to the especially high risk of experiencing barriers to proper nutrition. We can now see how residential schools and other colonizing practices have exposed Aboriginal peoples to particularly high risk factors also associated with addiction. This places Indigenous peoples at a greater risk of violence as well as negative health effects. Negative health effects are exacerbated by the isolation experienced by First Nations communities. Resources on reserves are often inadequate, and in order to receive proper medical attention, an Indigenous individual may be required to travel excessive distances and suffer burdens regarding inconvenience and accommodations. Indigenous people are discouraged as they are faced with trauma that seems unavoidable. First Nations man Ken Ward said he could no longer compete with the world and just wanted to surrender and let it go. A lack of positive strategies for dealing with personal conflict lead to breakdowns within the family and caused for guilt and shame to be carried for years. A number of news articles touch deeply as they address real-life accounts of suicide within Indigenous communities in Canada. In recent years, a number of these communities have entered a state of emergency due to morbidly high rates of suicide in both adults and youth. Perez speaks on how many of the suicides are intertwined as Indigenous peoples struggle to deal with the grief of losing family members and loved ones, engaging Indigenous populations in what seems like a perpetual cycle of grief and tragedy. Perez suggests that with greater control for Aboriginal peoples in both economic and social spheres, the issues are significantly reduced. This means that legislation plays a large role in the Indigenous suicide crisis, while it controls the power and resources the Indigenous community is able to access. The Indigenous suicide crisis is a tragic issue of social welfare and is perpetuated by gaps in funding and policy. One of the largest barriers to proper healthcare for Indigenous peoples regards the funding for health and mental health programs. This can in part be due to jurisdictional conflict between federal and provincial governments, which leads to controversy regarding who is obligated to front the fee. This dilemma often delays Indigenous access to medical services and challenges notions of Indigenous rights to healthcare. Unfair treatment can be assessed by looking at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 35 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms suggests that the government is prohibited from enacting laws limiting the practice of traditional medicine. Although Aboriginals are entitled to their traditional practices, the government is not obligated to fund or promote these services. Prosperity in this area will give control back to Indigenous peoples while connecting them to their culture. Section 7 of the Charter may be applied to issues regarding the delay in access to medical services by Aboriginal peoples. The delay faced by Canadian Indigenous people is a violation of security of the person. However, because of matters of jurisdiction within healthcare, there is no obligation upon the government to provide healthcare services generally. Section 15 can then be used to highlight issues of inconsistency of healthcare across the country and across certain populations. This section suggests that an individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, religion, color, sex, age, mental or physical disability. It can then be argued that Indigenous people do not equally benefit from the current healthcare scheme. In order to be compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, policies including provisions in the areas of social welfare and healthcare must be implemented. In order for Indigenous peoples to prosper, they need to be recognized as possessing the responsibility, authority, and capability to address their disagreements by making laws within their communities. Barriers to success experienced by First Nation peoples can be further reduced through the introduction of educational and mental health programs. Reducing confusion surrounding jurisdictional issues can be done through implementing Indigenous-run healthcare systems. By allocating this control to community members, programs will not only be specific to their immediate needs, but also more accessible. We must also continue to fortify relationships with Indigenous populations, as this will ensure frequent consultation regarding Indigenous-focused policy development. This implies an increased inclusion of Indigenous voices in decision-making and strategic planning.